Hello, thank you for joining us today for the public meeting on the Vessel Incidental Discharge National Standards of Performance. My name is Magali Orozco and I'm with ERG, a contractor for EPA. Before we get started, let's review a few housekeeping items. Audio is available for this presentation through your computer's mic and speakers. Please select computer audio on your go-to control panel. All attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the questions box on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We will have a dedicated time to answer questions during the presentation. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please contact us and we will try to troubleshoot the issues. And lastly, a recording of this presentation will be available at a later date. And now I will turn it over to Catherine Weiler from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Thanks for joining us today, Catherine.
Great, thank you, Maggie. Thank you for opening up the webinar. Before we get started, we want to remind everyone that the following EPA presentation is solely intended to provide information to the public on the recently proposed Vessel Incidental Discharge National Standards of Performance proposed rulemaking. The presentation does not represent final agency decisions regarding the proposed standards and does not create any rights or obligations. During the next hour and a half to 2 hours, we'll be presenting on the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. The slide in front of you shows that we'll be breaking up the presentation into 3 separate sections. After each section, we'll be providing a short question and answer session. The first section is to outline and provide the overview of the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act. The second section will focus on the actual proposed standards put out by EPA on October 26th. And the third section of the presentation will focus on stakeholder engagements. During the question and answer sessions, we want to stress that this is not a platform for submitting official comments on the proposed rule. We will go over how to submit those comments at the end of the presentation. So again, we will be answering clarifying questions during the Q&A. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can, but due to the time frame associated with the webinar, we will not be able to answer all questions. And again, just a friendly reminder, this is not an opportunity to provide formal comment. We ask that you provide any formal comments and submit those through the docket. Moving ahead into the presentation, I want to let you know that we'll have 2 other speakers today, Jack Falk and Juliette Chasson from the Office of Water at EPA. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Jack.
Thanks, Catherine. Numerous U.S. federal, state, and local requirements have been written over the years to control discharges from vessels. EPA began regulating incidental discharges from commercial vessels in 2008 in response to a court decision that found EPA didn't have the authority to exempt these vessels from its Clean Water Act permitting program. In response to that decision, EPA issued its first 5-year Vessel General Permit, or VGP, in 2008 that applied for the most part to commercial vessels greater than 79 feet in length. EPA reissued that permit in 2013, and a year later, we issued a Small Vessel General Permit, or SVGP, to provide a more streamlined approach to compliance for smaller vessels that Congress initially deferred from permitting, but that eventually were also subject to EPA's permitting program. But the VGP and SVGP were administered under EPA's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, permitting program, pursuant to Section 402 of the Clean Water Act. At the same time, the U.S. Coast Guard, states, and local authorities also have imposed various other discharge requirements in the same universe of vessels and discharges. Recognizing that this patchwork of federal, state, and local requirements was challenging for the vessel community, in December 2018, the President signed into law the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, or VIDA, that establishes a national regulatory framework under a new subsection P of Section 312 of the Clean Water Act. Under VIDA, EPA and the Coast Guard are required to develop new vessel incidental discharge regulations. VIDA also permanently prohibits federal regulation of incidental discharges from small vessels and commercial fishing vessels of all sizes, with the exception of ballast water. VIDA details the roles that EPA and the Coast Guard are to play in establishing new regulations and overseeing compliance with those new requirements. The first step, which is the topic of today's public meeting, is for EPA to develop national standards of performance within 2 years of enactment of VIDA. The second step is for the Coast Guard, within 2 years of EPA finalizing its standards, to finalize implementing regulations to ensure, monitor, and enforce compliance with those EPA standards. VIDA does also require EPA and the Coast Guard to review their respective regulations at least every 5 years and update them as necessary. It's important to remember what VIDA means during the period of time before EPA and the Coast Guard complete their respective rulemakings. Until a point in time after our standards are final and the corresponding Coast Guard implementing regulations are final, vessels must continue to follow the requirements of EPA's VGP and the Coast Guard's ballast water regulations, as well as any applicable state and local requirements. What that means for the proposed standards we're talking about today, and this is a very important point, is that our standards are not in effect and enforceable in some later point in time after the Coast Guard completes its own rulemaking process, which is very likely more than 2 years from now. And as I mentioned previously, with the exception of ballast water, as of December 2018, small vessels and fishing vessels exempted by VIDA are no longer subject to federal requirements for incidental discharges. We'll provide more details at the end of today's meeting on how to submit official public comments on our proposed standards, but just want to stress that the 30-day comment period closes in less than 3 weeks, and that this will be your one opportunity to offer comments for our consideration in finalizing these standards, which will very likely not be reviewed again for another 5 years. I also want to stress that any questions or comments submitted during this public meeting will not be treated as formal comments on the proposal or otherwise receive a written response. Our preference is that questions submitted today have to do with your need to better understand our proposal for purposes of submitting public comments to the docket through the regulations.gov website. So let's move on to what you're probably all most interested in hearing about, our proposed national standards of performance that were published in the Federal Register on October 26th. I know Federal Register notices can look intimidating, but if you break it down, the proposed discharge standards themselves only take up 7 of the 86 pages of that notice. Much of the rest of those 86 pages includes our rationale for the standards, definition, state petition procedures, and a long list of what is known in the VGP as Appendix G waters, and now called federally protected waters in our proposed standards. When reviewing the proposed standards, it's important to recall the parameters established in VIDA for EPA's consideration. VIDA requires the national standards generally to be no less stringent than the 2013 VGP unless EPA has new information or made a mistake in that permit that would now result in a less stringent standard. Per VIDA, these proposed standards rely on the same technology basis as the VGP and represent a reasonable level of treatment within the economic means of the vessel universe. Also consistent with the VGP, VIDA specifies that the standards can be numeric or narrative best management practices or a combination of both, and that these standards can distinguish between class, type, size, and age of vessels, which, as you'll see in our proposal, we did establish standards that address each of these different vessel characteristics in certain such situations. And finally, as required in VIDA, EPA worked with and received concurrence from the Coast Guard and consulted with the states in developing these proposed standards. EPA estimates approximately 82,000 vessels a year will be subject to these standards once final. In reviewing our proposal, you may notice that they look quite different than the requirements in the VGP. We went to great lengths to clarify the standards to improve implementability and enforceability. This includes a great deal of consolidation of similar requirements into one location. For example, you'll see that the requirements for equipment maintenance are largely now contained in one section. We also excluded recommendations from the VGP or other language that did not specify an actual requirement. Further, the standards have been reorganized according to the equipment from which they are discharged to make them more cohesive and easier to implement. We now have 20 specific discharge categories rather than the 27 plus categories in the VGP. For example, where the VGP previously had 3 individual sections for seawater piping biofouling prevention, seawater cooling discharge, and freshwater layup, the proposed standards consolidated these requirements under a single seawater piping category. In addition to these organizational and clarifying changes, we're proposing more substantial changes to the VGP requirements where new information and technology is demonstrated to be available and achievable, or where new information suggests less stringent limits than the VGP are appropriate. We'll dig into more of those in just a bit. It's important to note that pursuant to VIDA, the proposed standards are technology-based only, unlike EPA's authority for the VGP, which required a combination of technology-based and water quality-based requirements. I'll mention a bit later where states can petition EPA to address specific water quality concerns. Also, VIDA specifies that it's the Coast Guard regulations that will address self-monitoring, self-inspection, reporting, record keeping, education and outreach, and corrective actions, with similar considerations as EPA standards for these requirements to be at least as stringent as the VGP unless new information or mistakes were made. The Coast Guard regulations are also to include requirements for equipment design, construction, testing, approval, installation, and use. Here's a quick overview of the main sections of our proposed rule that includes 5 subparts. A, scope. B, general standards applicable to all discharges. C, standards for specific discharges. D, special area requirements, which is another name for federally protected waters. And E, procedures states to request changes to standards, regulations, or policy promulgated by EPA. Appendix A includes a list of federally protected waters similar to the VGP, Appendix G. I'll discuss each of these today, although mostly we'll be focusing on the proposed discharge standards in subparts B and D. And just before we take a break to answer some questions, I want to provide an overview of the scope of the proposed standards that we'll be discussing today. Generally, final standards will apply to all incidental discharges from commercial vessels 79 feet in length and above, and other non-recreational, non-armed forces vessels, such as research vessels and emergency rescue vessels. The ballast water standards will also apply to smaller vessels and fishing vessels of all sizes. Importantly, VIDA changes the waters in which EPA requirements will apply, extending the scope from 3 out to 12 nautical miles from shore once these standards are in force. This 12-mile contiguous zone demarcation is consistent with existing Coast Guard ballast water regulations, but does extend the area for all other discharges. So as you review our proposal, please consider the implications of that expanded area. Subpart A of the proposal also includes definitions of about 60 terms, but only a few of these are new terms specific to our proposal. Many of the definitions are identical to or only slightly modified from existing Coast Guard regulations, VIDA statutory language, the Clean Water Act, or the VGP. The proposal includes the relevant citation for each of these terms to simplify your review. A couple of the key new definitions are for fouling rating, marine growth prevention system, and oil to sea interface. This is also a good time to mention that our proposal does not address sewage other than when commingled with other incidental discharges, in which case the discharge of that commingled waste stream will be required to comply with both any existing sewage requirements and these proposed discharge standards. The proposed scope also incorporates VIDA's acknowledgement that safety of life at sea and other emergency situations may arise, not resulting from negligence or malfeasance, and that the standard would not apply if compliance with such would compromise the safety of life at sea. We expect the Coast Guard implementing regulations to include more specific language to address these considerations. One thing I want to mention about Subpart A is that it clarifies that nothing in today's proposed standards affects the applicability to the vessel of other provisions of federal law. And with that, let's take a break from the presentation to answer some of your questions about VIDA, EPA, and the Coast Guard roles, interim requirements, and the scope of the proposed standards before we move on to the actual discharge standards and other aspects of the proposed rule. So with that, Catherine.
Great, Jack. Thank you so much. Again, as Jack noted, at this time, we're accepting questions on the opening remarks provided by Jack, specifically those associated with the overview of VIDA and with the scope. I want to remind everyone we will not be able to answer all questions. So for some folks, if you've submitted a question, we may not be able to answer it. So we'll give a few minutes for the questions to come in. Hi folks, just a reminder, we're getting quite a few questions regarding specific discharges, and at this time we're asking folks to focus their questions more on the general applications of VIDA and some of the scoping clarifying questions. And again, we won't be able to answer many of the legal clarifying questions. You know, if your question is more of a why, it's unlikely that we'll be able to answer at this time. Again, this is clarifying questions to help you submit stronger comments during the public comment period. One of the questions that we can answer regarding compliance, one of the questions that just came in that we can answer is compliance and monitoring part of the U.S. Coast Guard regulations? Yes, it is. EPA is developing the national performance standards, and the U.S. Coast Guard will be developing the corresponding compliance and monitoring regulations. Another question that came in, question, does this apply to gray water but does not apply to sewage? If sewage and gray water are mixed, it does apply. If the sewage is standalone, the VIDA requirements do not apply. Jack, one question for you that you might be able to answer. The question is, once VIDA is in force, will all reports still have to be sent to the EPA?
Only if the Coast Guard regulations say that that's to be the case. I mean, I expect that won't be the case. So again, importantly, reports are still required per the VGP, and the Coast Guard ballast water regulations have a reporting requirement. And those will continue until the Coast Guard, until our standards are final and the Coast Guard's new implement regs are final. And then at that point, whatever the Coast Guard implementing regulations say will be the new reporting requirement. Whether that looks like what we have now or something drastically different, I think the standard is VIDA says the requirements need to be similar to the VGP requirements unless there's new information or a mistake had been made on previous permit. So it is premature to know what that might look like, but I would suspect the reports will go to the Coast Guard, not the EPA.
Thank you, Jack. Jack, another question for you. Does technology-based mean technology is based on only U.S. Coast Guard type approvals?
No, technology-based is a term of art that the Clean Water Act uses that really talks about that the standards are demonstrated through the use of really a piece of equipment or a practice, as opposed to establishing a standard based on a need to meet a desired endpoint. So we differentiate between a water quality based requirement. Sorry, I just got a message. My battery's low, but that wasn't me. Whereas a water quality based limit is based on the need to meet a water quality goal, irrespective of whether there's technology or a practice available to do so.
Great, thank you. Jack, another question for you. How does this impact state discharge regulations? Are they preempted?
For now, no. Once the Coast Guard implementing regulations are final, effective, and enforceable, at that point in time, states will no longer be able to adopt or enforce more stringent requirements than the federal requirements. However, one thing that we're not really going to talk about today, but that VIDA does actually give states the authority to enforce the provisions developed under VIDA. So states will be able to enforce our requirements, which is a new condition.
Thank you, Jack. One question that came in is, will this version of the presentation be posted? It's a bit different than what was posted. Thank you for that question. In fact, we tried to provide a presentation on our website that provided additional background materials. We wanted to spend the majority of this meeting speaking about the proposed standards. So the presentation is a bit different, with the focus of today's presentation more on the standards, and the focus on the one that's currently posted more on the background, more on what VIDA authorizes EPA to do. Looking ahead, this presentation along with a recording will also be posted to the website. Another question has come in regarding regulations.gov website. This is one that we probably can't answer. The question is that the website says there are 13 comments so far, but we only see 7 posted. We have at EPA have also noticed the lag. We don't control regulations.gov, so they get those up and posted as soon as they can. However, as long as your comment is submitted by the date, the deadline of November 25th, that comment will be part of the official docket.
Yeah, this is Jack. I believe they just scrub any comments received. I think for formatting or anything that may be too vulgar, I think they may not post, but there is typically a couple-day lag. And for us, without digging too much into it, I think are as curious as you are as to what those additional comments are that have not yet been posted.
Tom, a question for you that's come in. The question is, the contiguous zone under the Clean Water Act is 12 miles or 24 miles?
Yeah, so under the Clean Water Act, it's 12 miles, and that is, we get that question a fair amount just because there was a presidential proclamation, I believe, in some point in the 90s, saying that the U.S. was going to exert authority for the contiguous zone out to 24 miles. That proclamation was not retroactive. It did not retroactively change the scope of the Clean Water Act. And so our view, the EPA's view, consistently since the 90s for all programs has been that the contiguous zone for Clean Water Act purposes extends only out 12 miles.
Thank you, Tom. Jack, another question for you. And I think you've gone over this, so perhaps just a few clarifying statements. What is the relationship between VIDA and NPDES permits?
So NPDES permits are established under Clean Water Act Section 402. VIDA actually changed the VIDA law, which was signed into law at the end of December 2018, specified that EPA in the states could no longer regulate vessel incidental discharges under that permitting program, and that we would instead regulate such discharges under a new program under a different section of the Clean Water Act, Section 312, that they added a new Section P, which is under which we're developing these proposed standards. So looking off into the future, the VGP will go away, NPDES permits will go away for incidental discharges from vessels, and there will be these new, in essence, VIDA standards. And just to be clear, VIDA, actually, the requirements of VIDA were incorporated into the Clean Water Act. So it's just, we've shifted from a permitting program to a regulatory program where we're sharing the responsibility for developing those standards with the Coast Guard, or those requirements. We're developing standards, they're developing the implementing regulations.
Great, thank you, Jack. With that, I'm going to answer one more question from the question box, and then we're going to turn to Jack to go over the specific standards. One of the questions was, is there a list of the 20 categories, and how are the individual discharges not grouped in those, or how are the individual discharges grouped in those categories? That's a great transition question for us. We're going to spend the next approximately 25 minutes to talk about the standards themselves. So appreciate all the questions. Apologies that we're not able to answer all of them, but in order to get through the entire presentation today, we're going to go ahead and move on, and I'm going to turn it back over to Jack.
Thanks, Catherine. I'll show the category. I mean, just in quick answer to those 20 categories, I'll show the 20 categories, but fact is, we don't have a strict comparison, but in reading the standards, it should hopefully become somewhat clear as to where those standards came from, how we took the 27 and turned them into 20. But let me talk about the general discharge standards first. So the Subpart B of our proposed rule outlines 3 general discharge standards, which, for those of you familiar with the VGP, is based on the approach used in Part 2.1 of the permit. The general discharge standards apply to all vessels and incidental discharges covered by the rule and address 3 areas: general operation and maintenance, biofouling management, and oil management. The proposed standards are largely preventative in nature and incorporate best management practices to control the discharge of pollutants, including through reductions in the volume discharged and in areas subject to these proposed standards. In terms of comparison to the existing VGP, the requirements in the general O&M and oil management sections are largely the same. At first glance, though, they may seem quite different, but that's primarily because of the substantial consolidation that we made in these 2 sections. I do want to bring your attention to 2 changes in Subpart B. First, we moved the requirement for the use of environmentally acceptable lubricants, or EALs, into the oil management section, acknowledging that the use of EALs applies to any oil-to-sea interface and is not limited to just those that are specifically identified in the VGP. We do include a similar exclusion for instances when use of an EAL is technically infeasible. However, we're leaving it to the Coast Guard to define that term as part of its implementing regulations. One additional note about EALs, our proposed definition of oil to sea interface clarifies that such interfaces include those areas where lubricants can escape directly into surrounding waters, but also includes parts of equipment that can extend overboard, where a release of the lubricant would also result in a discharge directly into surrounding waters. Another notable change in Subpart B is the introduction of a biofouling management plan standard. While the VGP did require biofouling management measures such as selection of appropriate coatings and cleaning standards, the proposed standard would introduce a vessel-specific plan to be developed and followed to ensure that a cohesive strategy for managing biofouling and preventing the introduction of invasive species is in place for each vessel subject to these standards. The details of such plans will be established in the Coast Guard's implementing regulations. So here are the list of 20 discharges. 2 at the bottom were 2 that we determined to remove fish hold effluent and boat engine wet exhaust based on small vessels and fishing vessels no longer being subject to the discharge standards. You'll notice that this list is shorter. It's, again, save for this 2, not any different than the same general category of discharges in the VGP. For the 20 categories shown, 13 have substantially the same requirements as the VGP, 2 have slightly modified requirements, and 5 have more substantial requirements. Here are the list of standards that are substantially the same as the limits in the VGP. These 13 proposed discharge standards encompass the intent and stringency of the VGP, but also include changes for clarity, consistency, and enforceability. Here, I've highlighted 2 of the 20 discharge standards that have some slightly more substantial changes from the VGP. For bilges, we moved much of the details from the bilge water section of the VGP into the general standards in Subpart B. Also, vessels 400 gross tonnage and above would no longer be prohibited from discharging treated bilge water within 1 nautical mile of shore, but these vessels would be required to discharge while underway. The VGP requirement for discharging while underway was only triggered if vessels operated outside of waters subject to the VGP at least monthly, which led to confusion about whether and when a vessel may be authorized to discharge. We also expanded the distillation and reverse osmosis category to include discharges from all types of desalination and purification systems, and shifted the focus of the standard from keeping the brine away from other materials to prohibiting the use of toxic or hazardous materials for cleaning the system. So I just talked about 15 of the proposed discharge standards either being the same or only having changed slightly from the VGP. The proposed boiler standard is a good example of how virtually all the requirements would change in appearance, even though for many, our assessment is that the requirements are largely or essentially unchanged from the VGP. So in this slide, I have the VGP requirements on the left and the proposed VIDA standards on the right. As you can see, the VGP requires the discharge of boiler blowdown and economizers be minimized in port if chemicals or other additives are used. And for vessels greater than 400 gross tons, the VGP identifies 3 exceptions to the prohibition. The permit also prohibits blowdown in Appendix G waters and recommends discharges be as far from shore as practicable. The proposed VIDA standard simplifies this greatly, merely specifying boiler blowdown must be minimized when in port and prohibits discharge in federally protected waters. And we eliminated reference to economizers as there is no discharge from those pieces of equipment. At its core, we wrote the proposed standard understanding that all discharges must be minimized, which in essence would prohibit a vessel from discharging boiler blowdown more than necessary. It clarifies in particular that the blowdown must further be minimized when in port. The VGP also includes provisions for safety, a concept that we've incorporated into the scope, acknowledging that these standards don't apply if compliance would compromise the safety of life at sea. Additionally, the recommendation to discharge as far from shore as practicable is now a proposed requirement in the general O&M section applicable to all discharges. So, as you can see, while the VGP and proposed VIDA standards look quite different, we believe these requirements are essentially the same. As I mentioned, we're proposing more substantial changes from the VGP for 5 of the discharge categories, as shown on this slide: ballast tanks, exhaust gas emission control systems, gray water systems, hulls and associated niche areas, and seawater piping. So as with all things related to vessel incidental discharges, the ballast water discussion makes up about 1/3 of the Federal Register notice, with a great deal of that being explanatory language for why so much of the proposed standard is similar to the VGP and existing Coast Guard regulations. By and large, our analysis determined that the existing requirements do represent the best available technology, economically achievable standard as required under VIDA. That includes the numeric discharge limits, which we're proposing to remain the same, with the caveat that we drafted the numeric limits for organisms to apply using either the existing Coast Guard approved test methods to count living organisms or methods based on organism viability, should the Coast Guard identify any such methods as acceptable. It is worth noting that the proposed numeric discharge limits do not identify how compliance with those limits to be achieved. Instead, again, it is up to the Coast Guard to establish any equipment requirements as part of its implementing regulations, and which could resemble the current ballast water type approval process. While there is much that remains the same with ballast water, there are several notable changes. Importantly, the statutory language of VIDA was codified into our proposed standards, mandating ballast water exchange and flushing for 3 different scenarios. 1, any vessel with empty ballast tanks bound for the U.S. that discharges untreated, unpumpable residual waters and sediments into waters subject to these standards. 2, any vessel entering the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence Seaway via the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. And 3, any vessel voyaging between 2 ports or places of destination in the Pacific region, or between the Pacific region and certain locations in Canada or Mexico that discharge untreated ballast water. Note that the requirements for the Pacific region also specifies that vessels that transport lower salinity ballast water to lower salinity ports or places of destination in the Pacific region must continue to perform exchange and flushing unless that vessel uses a treatment system approved by the Coast Guard is capable of meeting significantly more stringent discharge standards than are currently established in the Coast Guard regulations. Each of these 3 exchange and flushing requirements do have exceptions, including for safety reasons, or if design limitations on an existing vessel would prevent such an exchange or flush from being conducted. Also, in certain instances, vessels aren't required to perform such an exchange or flushing if the vessel has no residual ballast water or sediments on board, the vessel retains all ballast water while in water subject to the proposed standards, or the empty ballast tanks on the vessel are sealed in a manner that ensures no discharge or uptake occurs. I do recommend, though, that you pay particular attention to the exemptions for each of these three exchange and flushing situations, as they are all not identical and they are all not the same as the existing requirements in the VGP. Our proposed rule also incorporates mandates from VIDA that certain vessels are excluded from having to meet the ballast tank standard. This includes any vessel that continuously takes on and discharges ballast in a flow-through system where EPA determines that system cannot materially contribute to the spread or introduction of aquatic nuisance species. Note that our proposed rule mentions that we're unaware of any such vessel in operation, but should one come into commercial operation, we would evaluate the ballasting configuration to determine if that vessel meets the statutory exemption. The proposed rule also codifies the VIDA exclusion of vessels in the National Defense Reserve Fleet scheduled for disposal if the vessel does not have an operable ballast water management system. And one other exclusion of note, we did carry forward the exclusion from the VGP of any discharges of ballast water consisting solely of water taken on board from a public or commercial source that meets the applicable US or Canadian drinking water requirements. Our proposed standards include several other revisions from existing requirements. We are proposing not to continue the requirement that vessel operators must minimize or avoid uptake of ballast water in areas and situations such as near sewage outfalls, dredging operations, in darkness, where infestations or populations of harmful organisms and pathogens are known to exist, and other areas identified in the VGP. We're proposing to remove this requirement because such measures are not practical to implement and usually beyond the control of the vessel operator. And thus, it's not an available measure or practice to minimize or avoid uptake of ballast in those areas and situations. Our proposed rule does incorporate several provisions from VIDA that can help address some of the situations identified above. For example, in cases of a known outbreak of harmful algal blooms, the state can submit a petition requesting EPA to issue an emergency order, with that emergency order required to identify appropriate best management practices to address that concern and impose specific requirements on the universe of vessels and potentially others as necessary. Also of note, similar to the proposed biofouling management plan, our proposed discharge standards include a requirement for a ballast water management plan, with the details of that plan to be in the future Coast Guard implementing regulations. The proposed standards do revise the universe of vessels subject to the numeric ballast water standards. Of note, all unmanned, unpowered barges were exempt in the VGP. However, our analysis found that the numeric discharge limits are appropriate for any such barge that is seagoing or that is part of a dedicated vessel combination, such as an integrated or articulated tug and barge unit. Proposing to extend the exemption for meeting the ballast water numeric discharge standards from lakers built prior to January 2009, as was done in the VGP, to exempt all lakers operating, or all vessels operating exclusively on Great Lakes, regardless of the build year. We analyzed these vessels in great detail and the potential options for treating ballast water and determined that technologies are not yet available to treat ballast from these vessels because of the unique nature of the vessels and their voyages and the nature of the Great Lakes waters. Our proposed rule includes an extensive discussion of our analysis of this universe and the potential options for managing ballast water beyond existing best management practices. 2 points I'd like to make about these vessels, though. First, we are soliciting input on whether it's appropriate for each of these vessels to submit an annual self-assessment to EPA, evaluating whether any treatment system is available and achievable, and also whether it's appropriate for EPA to consider extending this exemption to the universe of vessels that operate primarily, but not exclusively, in the Great Lakes, acknowledging that these vessels may potentially face similar challenges in meeting the numeric discharge standard. Second, it's important to be aware that Congress established a Great Lakes and Lake Champlain invasive species program that has as one of its stated purposes to develop and pilot ballast water management systems for use by commercial vessels operating solely within the Great Lakes. EPA recently announced a 5-year research and development plan with work to be led by the Lake Superior Research Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. EPA's expectation is that this enhanced research effort will find solutions to address the potential transfer of invasive species around the Great Lakes from these vessels. Our proposed rule did also evaluate best management practices included in the VGP for Great Lakes Lakers and assessed whether any of those practices were appropriate for a larger group of vessels. In fact, our proposed standard expands the requirement that any sea chest screen must be maintained and fully intact to apply to all vessels. So moving on to exhaust gas emission control systems, we're proposing standards that to a large extent incorporate the current IMO exhaust gas control system guidelines. You may recall that the VGP established a lower pH limit of 6.0 rather than 6.5 to account for the IMO allowance for compliance to be evaluated 4 meters from the hull, which was inconsistent with the EPA's permitting authority that requires compliance be demonstrated at the point of discharge or end of lease. With VIDA establishing new authorities, EPA is proposing to establish the compliance point consistent with the IMO guidelines, and as such, we're proposing a revised pH limit from 6.0 back to 6.5, and specified compliance could be met either at the point of discharge or 4 meters from the hull. We also propose to allow short-term exceedances of the pH limit for up to 15 minutes in any 12-hour period, consistent with similar procedures provided in the IMO guidelines for other continuously monitored parameters. This allowance provides for the normal short-term fluctuations that occur during system startup and shutdown, calibration, fuel changeover, etc. The exhaust gas emission control system section also proposes new requirements for exhaust gas recirculation, or EGRs. EGRs are used to reduce nitrogen oxide, or NOx emissions in marine exhaust. The proposed standard mirrors the 2018 IMO EGR guidelines and provides that EGR bleed-off water is excluded from having to meet the discharge standards applicable to exhaust gas cleaning systems, provided the vessel is underway and operating on low sulfur fuel that meets the MARPOL Annex 6 emission requirements that took effect in 2020. Also, consistent with the IMO guidelines, this proposed exemption from the discharge standard would not apply to any EGR bleed-off water that is retained on board the vessel in a holding tank. For gray water, much of the focus of changes in our new standards was to clarify that certain vessels in certain instances are prohibited from discharging near shore unless the vessel treats its gray water, or for those vessels without treatment have no remaining available gray water storage capacity. This includes prohibiting such discharges within 3 nautical miles for vessels that voyage beyond 3 nautical miles, and prohibiting such discharges within 1 nautical mile for vessels that voyage at least 1 but not 3 miles from shore. The proposed gray water standard also includes new requirements that any new ferries authorized by the Coast Guard to carry 250 or more people and any new build vessels greater than 400 gross tonnage must meet the numeric discharge standard or otherwise not discharge in waters covered by these proposed standards, which includes inland waters and marine waters out to 12 nautical miles from shore. Another proposed change is to eliminate the VGP clarification for gray water and bilge water that specified the concept while underway means traveling at a speed of at least 6 knots. EPA has no technical basis for such a speed restriction limited to these two discharges, so it's proposing discharging while underway no longer requires a minimum speed. For hulls, proposing several changes to the coating and cleaning requirements applicable to vessel hulls. Consistent with actions being addressed at the International Maritime Organization, EPA is proposing to prohibit the application of sibutrin on vessel hulls and niches and require removal or sealing of any coatings containing sibutrin by a date to be determined by the U.S. Coast Guard. The proposal also includes a requirement to regularly clean the hull, but prohibits in-water cleaning of biofouling that exceeds a fouling rating of FR20, unless the fouling is local in nature and origin, and cleaning does not result in a plume or cloud of paint, or an in-water cleaning and capture system is used. The proposed standard specifies any such in-water cleaning and capture system must be designed to capture coatings and biofouling organisms, filter biofouling organisms from the effluent, and minimize the release of biocides. Our use of fouling rating or FR rating to measure the severity of fouling is based on the U.S. Navy's Technical Manual on Waterborne Underwater Hull Cleaning of Navy Ships, published in 2002 and updated in 2006, with a copy of the manual available in our docket for this proposed rule. The proposed standard also prohibits in-water cleaning of any sections of the hull where the anti-fouling coating shows excessive cleaning actions, such as brush marks or blistering due to the internal failure of the paint system. And we've also included a new prohibition in federally protected waters that prohibits discharges from in-water cleaning of vessel hulls and niches in these waters. And the fifth standard I want to talk about with more substantial changes are for seawater piping systems, which include sea chests, grates, and similar appurtenances that accumulate macrofouling that we're specifying have to be fitted with a marine growth prevention system that includes one or a combination of chemical injection, electrolysis, ultrasound, ultraviolet radiation, or electrochlorination, an anti-fouling coating, or use of cupro-nickel piping. Also, upon identification of biofouling in seawater piping systems that exceed a fouling rating of FR20, reactive measures such as freshwater flushing or chemical dosing must be used to manage the macrofouling. Discharges resulting from reactive measures used to remove that macrofouling are prohibited in port, as is chemical dosing in federally protected waters. So Subpart D is the last portion of our proposed rule with discharge standards. And simply put, this subpart compiles proposed standards applicable to vessel discharges in waters consistent with the VGP Appendix G approach. VIDA specifies that our standards are to be at least as stringent as the VGP, including with respect to water subject to federal protection, in whole or in part for conservation purposes. As we worked on these standards, we decided that it would be easier for vessel operators to have all those additional requirements in one section of the rule. For most discharges, the proposed requirements in this section are unchanged from the VGP. Although we did propose a few additional prohibitions for discharges from certain activities associated with chain lockers, decks, hulls and niche areas, and seawater piping when operating in these waters. Appendix A provides the full list of areas for which vessels would be required to comply with Subpart D requirements, acknowledging that many of these areas may not have water suitable for navigation. One last comment, if you are interested in EPA's assessment of the incremental change in costs associated with the proposed rule, please take a look at the regulatory impact analysis developed for this proposal, a copy of which is available from the regulations.gov docket. And so beyond standards, I do want to touch on one more area of our proposal before we take a break for questions. Subpart E codifies the different opportunities for states to petition or apply to EPA to establish different discharge requirements. These aren't discharge standards per se, but do include procedures for states to revise national standards, for the Great Lakes states to work together to establish different, more stringent requirements for the Great Lakes, to petition EPA to issue emergency orders, or to apply to EPA to establish no discharge zones for one or more discharges covered under the VIDA standards. It's through these petitions that states have some ability to petition EPA for more stringent requirements specific to the protection of water quality in the state or to address specific invasive species concerns. I should point out that this subpart, by and large, merely just codifies the VIDA standards. However, we did include a comprehensive list of information expected to be included in any application for no discharge zone based on our experience with the existing sewage NDZ program. As you read the proposal, consider the list of information and let us know through the official comment process if you think that it's the appropriate information for EPA to assess these NDZ requests. Similarly, we'd appreciate your input on the appropriate information for other types of petitions as well. And with that, that completes the presentation on the proposed regulations, and I will turn back to Catherine for some more questions.
Great, thank you, Jack. We had quite a few questions come in during your presentation, so we'll go ahead and get started with those. But again, folks, please feel free to continue to ask us questions, and we'll do our best to answer them as they come in. The first question I'm going to give to Juliet. The question is, under hulls and associated niche areas, bullet number 2, what does according to certain listed specifications mean in the context of this bullet?
Thanks, Catherine. So in the proposed rule, we've outlined certain requirements for in-water cleaning and capture systems. Those include that they must capture coatings and biofouling organisms, filter biofouling organisms from the effluent, and minimize the release of biocides, among other requirements. So I would ask you to turn to that section of the rule for those specific listed specifications.
Thanks, Juliet. Jack, I'm going to throw another one your way. It says, could you please say again, and this might take you a second to get to that part of your speaking notes, but can you please say again the proposed changes for vessels that use only potable water for ballast, i.e. towboats that operate exclusively on inland river routes?
Yeah, so in essence, the proposed requirements are the same as the existing VGP requirements, and that being that vessels that use exclusively water, and it's not necessarily potable water. You know, there was a concept that onboard potable water generators may be a viable alternative to producing ballast water for use on board that vessel, but the proposed standards actually are specific to potable water, be it from the US or Canada that's taken on board specifically for ballast, that water, if not commingled with other ballast, is not subject to the numeric discharge standards.
Great, thank you, Jack. One question that I will take is, will the comment period be extended due to the recent presidential election? Administration change will occur and the federal government is not permitted to finalize regulations during this transition. Therefore, there is no rush to finalize the regulation as needed. In the past, EPA has many statutory deadlines that were not met due to these types of changes. Additional time is needed to review. How can formal requests for an extended period be submitted? The comment period right now is closing on November 25th. If you would like to formally request for an extension to that public comment period, we ask that you do so via the docket. The next question that's come in, I will also take. The provision for review every 5 years would apply to all national standards covered under this rule, including EPA proposed approach to ballast water. Yes, that is correct. Per VIDA, EPA is required to review all of the national standards if new information is available every 5 years. The next question I'm going to give. Go ahead.
Catherine, if I can just clarify, the VIDA actually says we have to review at least every 5 years and update as applicable. So there is an expectation that we'll be reviewing. Whether or not we're updating will be based on what information is available.
Great, thank you. Great clarification, Jack. The next question I'm going to give to Tom. Tom, can Clean Water Act citizen suits be used to enforce VIDA regulations?
Thanks. Yeah, and I assume that question is asking, can this Clean Water Act citizen suit provision in 505 be used against dischargers? And the answer is, as I read the statute, I believe that's correct. And it looks like there was specifically an amendment made to section 505F to clarify that an effluent limitation or standard for the purposes of the citizen supervision includes standards of performance or requirements that are developed under section 312P, so this VIDA rulemaking. Of course, those standards aren't going to be in effect, as we've said before. Those standards aren't going to be in effect and therefore not subject to citizen suit enforcement until the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard regulations are final and enforceable a couple of years from now.
Great, thank you, Tom. Another question came in regarding or indicating that this is not a public meeting. Just to clarify for folks on the phone, this is a public meeting, but it's not a public hearing. Public hearings allow for the public to provide comments on a rulemaking, but again, this is a public meeting and is not intended to be a public hearing where all of the information exchanged is submitted to the docket. So public hearings are used to allow several hours of answers and questions, and those are submitted to the docket. Again, this is more of a clarification meeting that's open to all the public. Jack, a question for you. Does the shift from permitting to regulatory regime means that there will be no need for a ENOI?
Unless the Coast Guard adopts a similar concept, the notice of intent is actually an aspect of our Clean Water Act permitting program. VIDA, when it identified which aspects of the VGP we're responsible for and which the Coast Guard is responsible for, included a lot of different sections of the VGP, but did not include the NOI section. So there may be electronic reporting, there may be electronic identification initially, but there will not be any NOI.
Thank you. Juliet, next question for you. In-water hull cleaning, scamping, etc. are known pollutant generating activities from point source locations. Will the VIDA require mechanized equipment to collect for treatment and approved disposal of potentially toxic processed wastewaters and debris and other deleterious waste removed?
Yes, so we have included requirements for in-water cleaning and capture devices. Those are listed under the holes and associated niche area section. So that section is divided into hull coatings and cleaning. And so we do have requirements in the cleaning section for those.
Great, thank you. One comment regarding the preamble versus the regulatory text. There's a lot of good and important language in the explanatory section. Is there any reason why some of that could not be moved into the rule itself, as doing so could improve the understanding and compliance? So just as a reminder to folks, we're moving from Clean Water Act 402 vessel general permitting regime into a Clean Water Act 312 regulatory regime. As regulations are drafted under 312, we are limited to some extent to the very specific requirements of the discharge itself. So we do ask that everyone take the time needed to read through the preamble to understand the direction for the change, why there was a change from the VGP, and what that change means. We do believe we did our best to provide a lot of explanatory information in that section, but it cannot be transferred into the rule itself. The next question is, do some of the 20 discharge requirements apply differently for existing and new build vessels? The answer to that is yes. Gray water is one of the examples where the requirements are different for current vessels versus new build vessels. One question, what's the difference between today's public meeting and tomorrow's public meeting? We intend to provide the same exact presentation with the same script. The questions may be a little bit different, but the information being presented will be exactly the same exact slides, same script. It will also be available on the website. And Jack, a question for you. Regarding unmanned, unpowered barges, are they fully exempt from the VGP or VIDA, or just from meeting the numeric standards?
I believe just fully exempt, exempt from meeting the numeric discharge standards. There are actually two different sections of exemptions or exclusions with the ballast water section. One is specific to exclusion from the entirety of the ballast water requirements, and the other is exclusion from the discharge requirements. And I believe the ballast water or the unmanned unpowered barge requirements are specific to the discharge standards.
One question is, thank you for the information. Would a recording be possible? The answer is yes. Both the webinar recording as well as the slides will be available on our EPA website. All right, folks, we're still getting some questions in, and we're scrolling through to see what additional questions we'll be able to answer. I would like to offer maybe it's 3:10 right now. I'd like to take a 5-minute break to allow the EPA team to compile an additional set of questions to answer. Give everyone a quick break to grab a drink of water, and we'll resume the Q&A session here at 3:15. Hi, this is Catherine Myler again with EPA. Thanks so much for staying with us here this afternoon. Again, we're going to answer a few more questions and answers, and then we'll resume our presentation. I hope everyone was able to catch a quick break during that 5-minute pause. We're going to go ahead now and answer a few additional questions that we received during the Q&A period. One comment or question, if you will, was the fact that regarding the docket and the fact that there's a letter from 10 senators requesting an extension. Just so folks know, you are welcome to review all the comments that are currently available in the docket. And yes, we have received that, and we're happy to make everyone else aware on the phone that we received that comment. Again, all comments are available to folks in the docket. The next question is for Juliet. Would the biofouling management plan be above and beyond what's already contained in a vessel's ballast water management plan, as they do address biofouling aspects?
Thank you, Catherine. We can't fully answer that question at this time because it will depend on the U.S. Coast Guard regulations as well. So our requirement currently is that there is a plan to minimize biofouling organisms, but the Coast Guard will be determining the details of that plan. So we hope to work with them to finalize that in the future.
Great, thank you. One question was, do we know when the presentation will be posted? We hope to get the presentations posted shortly after all 3 public meetings. They'll be reviewed by our website team, and then we'll get those up and running. Best guess is that these will be made available in a week to 10 days on our website all 3 meetings will be posted at the same time. The next question is, what will be the process for reviewing and commenting on the U.S. Coast Guard regulations as they are developed? Similar to the EPA rulemaking, the Coast Guard will be putting out a notice of proposed rulemaking for public comment. As Jack noted earlier in the presentation, the Coast Guard has under VIDA 2 years to develop their corresponding regulations. We've been working closely with the Coast Guard on the development of the standards. But again, they have the 2-year time frame under VIDA, but the public will also have an opportunity to comment separately on their rulemaking. Jack, a question for you. Can you go through the requirements for EALs, for example, the requirement to use EALs in deck machinery and the change in the definition of the oil to sea interface?
Sure. So we don't believe it's a change in interpretation or implementation of the EAL requirements. The existing requirement is that oil to sea interfaces are where a release of oil would result in a direct release into surrounding waters. And all we are really clarifying is that for equipment, say on board deck, where there are appurtenances that hang over the side of the ship, where a release from that portion of the equipment would result in a discharge directly to surrounding waters, is what we are saying is a oil to sea interface, and also subject to the EAL requirements. And then again, just to clarify, the technical and feasibility determination that we had I believe 4 criteria that could be evaluated, determine whether or not that EAL was technically feasible or technically infeasible. We're leaving that determination to the criteria for making such determination to the Coast Guard.
Great, thank you, Jack. Jack, another question for you regarding gray water. Under the gray water discharge numeric limits, were the numeric limits established in the VGP? If so, where?
The numeric limits were established in the VGP. It was a bit of an odd reference. The limits were actually in the cruise ship section, so in part 5.1 or potentially even 5.2 were the limits, and then the gray water section of the body of the permit actually referenced those numeric requirements in section 5.1 or 2. So they are existing requirements. We did tweak which standards applied. There was a percent removal requirement that we removed based on our assessment that there was a reference to our secondary drinking or secondary treatment standards for wastewater that really was more appropriate for treating domestic sewage than it was for gray water. So we removed that percent removal requirement, but the rest of the requirements by and large were in the existing VGP.
Great, thank you. Jack, next part is a 2-part question regarding ballast water and state petitions, and I'm not clear from the question, whether it's specific to the Great Lakes petitions or the state petitions more generally. So I'm going to ask the two-part question and we'll see how we do. Does the state petition have to come from the state in whose waters the outbreak is known to exist? Or can other states which do not wish to receive the ballast water from the state's waters petition to limit uptake from that state's waters?
That's an interesting question. I think our interpretation has been that it's states petitioning for management of vessels within their own state waters. I'm not sure if an NDZ provision potentially would be where a state could limit discharges from vessels coming from other states in that manner, but I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine, or if you want to clarify, but I believe that we had interpreted it to applicable to activities within the state.
Correct. So that is an interesting question. So appreciate that question from the public.
And this is Tom. I'm going to chime in and say, when you say we've interpreted, I think you just mean internally as we've been thinking about it. I don't think the agency has formally interpreted the whole thing.
Correct. It's not in our preamble. It's not in our preamble or our regulatory text. I think with that, a number of the questions are repeat from other questions. There is one question, Jack. We'll probably close with this one and then we'll move on to Juliet, I believe, has the next section of the presentation. And that is, how will VIDA regs apply to vessels in shipyards and other similar non-typical operations of vessels as a mode of transportation?
The same way they were subject to requirements prior to VIDA. I think it gets somewhat complicated quickly, but I mean, these discharges do still apply to vessel incidental discharges when operating as a mode of transportation. So I think there's a point where a vessel may no longer be considered in that mode. And in dry dock, I think that happens to be the case, but VIDA did not change how that applies.
Great, thank you, Jack. With that, I suggest that we turn now to Juliet for the next session of the presentation.
Thank you, Jack and Catherine. So now we'll turn over to stakeholder engagement opportunities, including resources that you may be interested in and directions on submitting formal public comments. We first want to direct you to some of our key web pages that highlight information about these proposed standards and our Vessels, Marinas, and Ports program more generally. Our Vessels, Marinas, and Ports homepage can be accessed by going to www.epa.gov/vessels-marinas-and-ports. We've included that link here at the bottom of the slide for your reference. This homepage contains links to all of the topics housed within the Vessels, Marinas, and Ports program, but information specific to commercial vessels, including on our proposed rule, can be accessed by clicking on the commercial vessels link under our vessel discharges subheading, which we have circled here in red. Once you've clicked on that link through our homepage, you'll be brought to our commercial vessel discharge standards page, which we have included at the top of the slide. Our Vessel Incidental Discharge Act webpage includes information on VIDA, and our stakeholder engagement opportunities webpage highlights both current and previous stakeholder opportunities, including information on these public meetings and pre-proposal outreach efforts and consultations. Also available on our stakeholder engagements webpage is an introductory slide deck where we provide information on the newly proposed standards, post-proposal stakeholder engagement opportunities, and the public comment submission process. We recommend that you visit these web pages to learn more about EPA regulation of commercial vessel discharges and the rulemaking effort under VIDA. Additionally, we want to remind you all that today is just one of 3 public meetings. We will be holding 2 more public meetings, one on November 10th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and one on November 17th from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We intend to cover the same material on our end for these 2 subsequent meetings. However, the questions asked of us during each meeting may differ. Importantly, you may want to submit formal public comments to EPA on the proposed rule. These are due no later than November 25th, 2020. To submit formal comments, please go to regulations.gov website and access the docket ID EPA HQ OW 2019-0482. The instructions for submitting comments through the system are available at regulations.gov and can be as simple as clicking on a comment button on the docket homepage and entering your information and attaching any relevant files that you're looking to include with your comments. The system does ask if your comments are being provided as an individual or as part of an organization, although you are also able to submit anonymous comments if you so choose. EPA will consider each comment submitted when finalizing the standards. We want to highlight that if you want your comment officially considered as part of the rulemaking process, you will need to submit it through regulations.gov. In addition to specific comments you may have, we also want to bring to your attention that we're looking specifically for input on certain topics in this proposed rule. We've highlighted some of these topics on this slide, and they include how best to define areas with coral reefs and the public availability of navigational charts for identifying such areas, the potential treatment and reporting requirements for vessels with ballast water operating either exclusively or primarily on the Great Lakes, use of a static list of federally protected waters consistent with the approach used in the VGP and the additional discharge-specific requirements in those waters, details on the use of non-fluorinated foams for firefighting certification, inspection, testing, training, and maintenance, and procedures for state petitions to EPA for more stringent requirements, such as for emergency orders and no discharge zones. The proposed rule includes several additional topics for which we are specifically seeking additional input, including for gray water, bilge water, and hull coatings. The specific requests for input can be found in the relevant sections of the preamble for the rule, which is essentially the front end of the rule. Please pay particular attention to these requests for information. We welcome your input on these topics. Finally, we've put together some tips that we hope you will find helpful for drafting your formal comments. Reviewing and developing an approach to address each of the comments received can be a significant effort on the part of EPA. The tips on this slide will help us to more efficiently review and consider each of the comments submitted to EPA as we finalize the rule. The tips include being certain to include the docket ID number and other identifying information of the proposed rule, outline comments according to the proposed rule outline, explain why you agree or disagree with the proposed language, include any scientific, technical, or economic data to support your comment, suggest alternative language and provide examples. In other words, if you disagree with the proposed standard, we really want to hear not just why you may disagree or what you may disagree with, but what alternatives you would suggest and what data you may have to support your position. And please pay attention to requests in the proposed rule for public input to specific topics that we listed on the previous slide. In addition to these tips, you can find more tips and EPA guidance for submitting formal comments on the link included here at the bottom of the page, such as reminders to not send confidential business information and to accompany any multimedia submissions by a written comment.
Great, thank you, Juliet. We're going to turn to Q's and A's again. Again, we wanted to give folks an opportunity to ask any clarifying questions on the actual submission of public comments to the docket, ask questions about the information that Juliet just presented. But if we don't get any specific questions to this section, we'll go back and we'll dive into a few more questions that were asked during the previous section delivered by Jack Falk. All right, we're not getting any specific questions on submitting public comments, so we'll go ahead and dive into a few more questions that we're able to answer. Again, not all questions will be answered today. As a reminder, we are hoping to use this time to offer clarifying information. A number of the questions that are coming in are very specific to U.S. Coast Guard requirements. Again, monitoring, enforcement, application. Again, we are developing the standards, and some of the questions are not within the purview of our ability to answer. So if you have not received an answer to your question, it is either that we don't feel at this time that's within our purview to answer. Jack, one question for you is, will these proposed standards be subject to Clean Water Act Section 401 water quality certification and CZMA Section 307 consistency determinations?
So they will not be subject to 401 certifications, and we're actually undergoing the CZMA consistency determination right now. Our determination went out to the states after the rule was proposed, and the states have a certain period of time to respond. So CZMA, yes. 401, no.
Thank you. Jack, another question for you. Are all permanently moored vessels that are unmanned or unpowered exempt from having to meet VIDA rules as they were previously, or is it just limited to restaurants, hotels, and casinos now?
I don't believe there was an intent for it to be different. My suggestion is if you think the proposal is not clear, or if it seems to have changed, that you submit a comment suggesting what could be added to clarify, and we'll look at that and either figure out needs clarifying language or that potentially would need to change, but the intent was not to change that provision.
Great, thank you. Jack, the next one is a ballast water IMO question. So it's a pretty long question. I will try and read it slowly to you. The IMO Ballast Water Convention includes an exception for ballast discharged from a ballast tank, which has been fully managed, but may also contain locally ballasted water, exception A 3.5. This exception allows semi-submersible vessels and others to operate in international waters. A similar U.S. exemption would harmonize domestic and international regulation and facilitate many commercial operations without increasing risk. Can such an exemption be added to VIDA?
I will say that we did not discuss that exception in detail, and my suggestion is that you provide comment to EPA with details about that and the benefit of including such an exception or exemption, but we did not include it more for not considering it in any detail.
Great, thank you, Jack. Jack, another question for you. Will VIDA exempt vessels on innocent passage not calling U.S. ports or anchorages in the 12 nautical mile zone?
I mean, we have language in our proposal that talks about innocent passage. It's been a topic, and I'm trying to find exactly where it is, but I think it's in 139.3 where we talk about other federal laws, and we make reference. I mean, I can read you exactly what it says. And nothing in this part shall be construed to affect, supersede, or relieve the master of any otherwise applicable requirements or prohibitions associated with a vessel's right to innocent passage as provided for under customary international law.
Great, thank you, Jack. Juliet, a question for you. We had a question along these lines, but this one's slightly tweaked, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it again. Would the biofouling management plan be above and beyond what's already contained in a vessel's ballast water management plan, as they both address biofouling aspects?
Thank you, Catherine. So as I mentioned before, we include our requirement for vessels to have the biofouling management plan, but the U.S. Coast Guard will be determining the details for that. So it's not really possible for us to answer that question at this time, but we will be working with the Coast Guard to develop those elements.
Catherine, if I can add one thing, I think
Sure.
one of the, we don't know the details. The ballast water management plan, I believe, only applies to vessels with ballast water tanks. What we're proposing will apply to all vessels covered under the permit. So we may not know the details, but I think the expectation that the universe of vessels required to develop those plans will increase.
That's correct. Thanks, Jack. And I will add as well that the vessel general permit had a lot of requirements embedded within different sections that are quite similar to what may be included in vessels that currently have a biofouling management plan, including inspection requirements, anti-fouling system requirements, and the like. So we do think that a lot of those requirements will be similar as well.
Great, thank you. We just had a question come in to indicate that if we submitted a comment to the docket that does not yet appear on regulations.gov, do you recommend that we resubmit? We're not familiar, again, we don't manage regulations.gov and not familiar with the time frame for submitting. You know, I do think they take a little bit of time to get them posted, but absolutely, if you don't see your comment, we would definitely recommend resubmitting to the docket. Jack, a question for you. As VIDA seems to define discharges based on the equipment they come from, has a provision been made for combined ballast and gray water tanks as often used on cruise ships?
Specifically, no. The way we've interpreted our requirements is that any commingled discharges are subject to the requirements for both of those pieces of equipment. So commingled gray water and ballast tanks would be subject to any applicable discharge standards for gray water and also for ballast water. But I do think comments on any challenges or how that may or may not work for cruise ships would be appreciated.
Okay, we have a few questions still coming in. I'd like to ask the EPA at this time to do a quick scan of the questions to see if there's any additional questions that folks feel comfortable answering. After we go through those remaining questions, I'll be turning the mic over to our Deputy Assistant Administrator, Lee Forsgren, to give closing remarks. So again, at this time, I'm asking the EPA team to take a quick peek at some of the additional questions to see if those are within our purview and if we're able to answer those. And in a moment here, I'll turn to each of you to see if there's any remaining questions that you're able to answer for the public meeting. Tom, I'm going to start with you. Want to see if there's any additional questions that you're able to answer at this time?
No, I'm not seeing anything right now. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Tom. Juliet, any additional questions that you're able to answer at this time that are within EPA's purview to answer?
Not at this time, Catherine. Thank you.
And Jack, I know you've been running the show here, but are there any additional questions that you were able to see that you're able to answer at this time?
Well, just starting at the bottom, there is a question that asks about for ballast water that our proposed standards no longer exempt coastwide crude tankers that were exempt in Coast Guard regulations, but EPA did not exempt those vessels. But we didn't require those vessels to have Coast Guard type approved systems. And so the question really is, did we estimate costs for these ships to potentially have to upgrade to Coast Guard type approved ballast water management systems, or for the manufacturers to undergo type approval for these models? And in fact is, the way we drafted our standards, we don't say the vessels have to use Coast Guard type approved ballast water management systems. It may be safe to assume that's what these vessels will have to do, but we establish the standards, and then the Coast Guard will establish in essence, the equipment requirements for how vessels will be able to demonstrate compliance with those standards.
Great, thank you, Jack. Jack, any other questions that you're able to answer at this time?
I'm trying to race through here. Yes, there's a question regarding air gap seals and oil to sea interfaces that basically comment that EPA is sought to clarify that air gap seals are not oil to sea interfaces if in a non-leaking condition. And the comment is, does EPA recognize that air gap seals are not foolproof and often leak, particularly when damaged by fishing nets, etc.? That is a topic that we've discussed over the last several years, and I believe that the approach that we took is really for, in essence, what is or is not an oil to sea interface where a piece of equipment breaks. The expectation is that what vessel has to meet the applicable oil management requirements, and if it's not a oil to sea interface, I think any piece of equipment could break and have a release. But we're really looking, if there's clarification of why that is more an oil to sea interface than a non-oil to sea interface, we take that input in comments. But that has been somewhat of a challenge for us to fully understand, which I think there have become quite a number of those air seals that became popular, not necessarily because of the EAL requirement, but seemingly more so since the EAL requirement became part of our VGP.
Great, thank you, Jack. With that, I just took, there are some questions on the questions and answer sessions. Just so folks know, we'll be passing along the U.S. Coast Guard questions that we feel fall within the Coast Guard purview onto the U.S. Coast Guard to help with the development of their requirements. And then we also intend to use some of these questions as part of our Q&A page on our website. So we'll be updating those as questions come in, both questions within the docket as well as some of the question and answers during the webinar that we feel would be valuable for the public as a whole. So we will be adding some of these to the Q&A on our website. With that, I'd like to go ahead and thank everyone for attending today. We appreciate your time. We hope you found this session valuable. We do want to remind everyone that the next two public meetings, the presentation, the webinar itself in terms of the slides and in terms of the public, the comments provided by Jack, Juliet, and myself will be the same. The only difference between the three meetings will be the Q&A sessions that are provided after each subsection. Again, and with that, I'd like to turn it over to our Deputy Assistant Administrator, Lee Forsgren, to provide some closing remarks for the meeting.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Jack and team. I would say I'm really pleased. I apologize for being a couple moments late. I started just as Catherine and Jack started the proposal, so I have listened to all of the questions. They've been very I appreciate the input. I would say that if you have any comments, please provide them to the docket. If you have any, if you think we have misinterpreted something, please provide that for the docket. But with that, I would say we do have a statutory deadline that we're aggressively trying to meet. And we are actively working toward that. And we appreciate the input from all parties. And with that, I'll close out and give people 15 minutes back.